The family cabin was always a place that felt like stepping back in time. Its weathered wooden beams and the faint smell of pine carried a weight of memories so thick you could almost feel them pressing against your skin. Every summer growing up, we'd spend long, lazy weeks here, swimming in the lake during the day and roasting marshmallows over the fire at night. But this time was different. I arrived first, pulling up to the gravel driveway in the late afternoon. The sun was low, casting golden light over the forest, and the air smelled of damp leaves and impending rain. My cousin, Caleb, was supposed to meet me here later. It had been years since we'd last been alone together, and I wasn't sure what to expect. I unpacked my things and set about starting a fire in the stone hearth. The flickering flames brought some warmth to the cabin, but I couldn't shake the chill creeping up my spine. Being here without the noise of the whole family felt strange. Intimate, even. It was just me, the quiet hum of the forest outside, and the distant sound of rain tapping against the roof. Caleb arrived just after sunset. The headlights of his truck lit up the darkened clearing as he pulled in. When he stepped out, it was like the air in the room shifted. He looked the same, yet different. Broader shoulders, a stronger jawline, and a confidence in his step that hadn't been there before. But his smile was the same, warm and disarming. "Long time, huh?" Caleb said, slinging a duffel bag over his shoulder as he stepped inside. His voice had deepened since I'd last heard it, but there was still a playful edge to it. "Yeah," I replied, suddenly aware of how small the cabin felt now that he was here. "It's been a while." The tension in the cabin settled in like a heavy fog. Caleb moved around the space with an easy confidence, unpacking his things and setting them on the counter as if no time had passed since our childhood summers. I busied myself by adjusting the fire, more to have something to do with my hands than because it needed tending. The flickering light from the hearth danced across the walls, casting shadows that seemed to lean in, listening. "You didn't have to get here so early," Caleb teased, setting a six-pack of beer on the table. "You could have waited for me and saved yourself the spooky loner vibe." I smirked, though my back was still turned to him. "Somebody had to get the fire going before you showed up. You always were terrible at that." He laughed, the sound low and warm, like the crackle of the flames behind me. "Fair enough. Guess some things never change." The words hung in the air longer than they should have, their weight pressing down between us. It was true. Some things hadn't changed. The way Caleb's presence could fill a room, the way his laugh could both put me at ease and leave me feeling off balance, and the way being around him stirred something inside me that I didn't know how to name, even after all these years. Dinner was simple, grilled sandwiches and a bag of chips we'd found in the pantry. Caleb cracked open 2 beers, sliding one across the table to me as we ate. Conversation flowed easily, starting with light topics, work, family updates, but inevitably circling back to memories of this place. "Remember the time we got caught sneaking out to the lake at midnight?" Caleb asked, leaning back in his chair with a grin. "Uncle Rob nearly had a heart attack when he found our empty beds." I chuckled, the memory vivid. "Yeah, and we thought hiding in the boathouse would somehow make us invisible. You were convinced he couldn't swim and wouldn't bother looking for us." "Hey, it was a solid plan," Caleb defended, raising his beer in mock pride, "except for the part where the flashlight beam landed right on my face." We both laughed, the sound filling the cabin and chasing away the earlier tension. For a moment, it felt like we were kids again, untouched by the complications of adulthood. But as the laughter faded, the silence that followed was different, charged. I looked down at my drink, the amber liquid catching the firelight, and asked the question that had been nagging at me since I'd agreed to this weekend. "Why now, Caleb? Why did you want to come back here after all this time?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he ran a hand through his hair, his expression shifting to something more serious. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I guess I just missed it. Missed us." The words hit me like a punch to the chest. I forced myself to meet his gaze, but the intensity there made it hard to breathe. It was the kind of look that said more than words ever could, that stripped away pretense and left nothing but raw, unguarded truth. "I missed it too," I said softly, the admission feeling like a crack in the armor I'd built around myself. The fire popped, breaking the moment. Caleb stood abruptly, grabbing the empty beer bottles and tossing them into the trash. "I'm gonna grab another. You want one?" "Sure," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. As he opened the fridge, I took a deep breath, trying to shake the unease creeping over me. But it wasn't the kind of unease that came from fear. It was something else entirely, something I'd spent years trying to bury. The storm rolled in overnight, the sound of rain drumming against the roof and wind rattling the windows. I woke to the cold, the fire having burned down to embers. Pulling a blanket around my shoulders, I padded to the hearth to stoke it back to life. "Couldn't sleep either, huh?" I jumped at the sound of Caleb's voice. He was leaning against the doorway to the small kitchen, his hair mussed from sleep and a faint shadow of stubble on his jaw. He was wearing only a pair of sweatpants, and the sight of him in the dim light sent a jolt through me that I quickly tried to suppress. "Just cold," I said, my voice too casual as I focused on the fire. "Thought I'd get it going again." Caleb walked over, his movements slow and deliberate. He crouched beside me, so close I could feel the heat radiating off him. "Here, let me." Our hands brushed as he reached for the poker, and the contact was like a spark igniting dry kindling. I froze, every nerve in my body suddenly on high alert. Caleb seemed to hesitate too, his hand lingering just a fraction of a second longer than necessary before he pulled back. Neither of us said anything as he tended to the fire. The flames grew, casting a golden glow over his face and highlighting the sharp lines of his cheekbones. When he finally looked at me, his expression was unreadable, but his eyes, they burned. "Why do you always do that?" he asked, his voice low. "Do what?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Act like you're not feeling the same thing I am." The air between us crackled, the tension almost unbearable. I wanted to deny it, to laugh it off or change the subject, but I couldn't. Not this time. Instead, I whispered the only thing I could. "Because I don't know how to." The room seemed to hold its breath, the silence heavy and electric. Caleb's gaze didn't waver, and for a moment I thought he might say something to fill the void. But he didn't. Instead, he reached out, slowly, tentatively, and brushed his fingers against mine. It was such a small gesture, yet it sent a shiver racing up my spine. I couldn't move, couldn't look away. "You don't have to know how," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "You just have to stop running from it." His words hung in the air, a challenge, an invitation, and a confession all at once. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. The fire crackled softly, the only sound in the room besides our breathing. Caleb's hand lingered on mine, his touch light but deliberate, and I felt my resolve slipping. Every rational thought, every reason why this was a terrible idea, faded into the background. All I could focus on was the warmth of his skin, the way his eyes seemed to see straight through me, and the undeniable pull between us that had been simmering for years. "Caleb," I began, my voice shaky, but he cut me off with a small shake of his head. "Don't overthink it," he said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "For once, just feel it." I wanted to argue, to push him away and pretend like this wasn't happening. But the truth was, I didn't want to. Not anymore. The weight of years of denial, of pretending there wasn't something more between us, pressed down on me until I couldn't hold it in any longer. Before I could stop myself, I leaned in, closing the small distance between us. Caleb's breath hitched, and for a split second I wondered if I'd made a mistake. But then his hand slid up to cup my jaw, his touch firm and grounding, and the space between us disappeared. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant, like we were testing the boundaries of something fragile. But it didn't stay that way. It deepened. the years of tension and unspoken feelings pouring out in a way words never could. His lips were warm and insistent, and the taste of beer lingered faintly as he tilted his head to draw me closer. My hands found their way to his shoulders, the solid weight of him grounding me even as everything else felt like it was spinning out of control. The firelight danced around us, casting shifting shadows on the walls, and the storm outside raged on as if the world itself were mirroring the chaos inside me. When we finally pulled back, our foreheads rested together, and neither of us said a word. Our breaths mingled in the small space between us, and I felt a strange mix of relief and fear settle in my chest. Relief that I'd finally let myself feel this, and fear of what it might mean. "I've wanted to do that for longer than I care to admit," Caleb said, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, but there was a vulnerability in his eyes that I'd never seen before. "Me too," I admitted, the words feeling both liberating and terrifying. "But what does it—" "It doesn't have to mean anything right now," he interrupted gently. "Let's just be here, together." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The weight of what had just happened was too much to process all at once, and the thought of trying to define it felt impossible. But Caleb was right. We didn't have to figure it all out tonight. For now, it was enough to just exist in this moment, to let ourselves feel without overthinking. We stayed by the fire for hours, talking about everything and nothing. The tension that had been so heavy before was still there, but it had shifted into something different, something warmer, more open. Caleb's hand rested on my knee as we talked, his touch grounding me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. As the storm outside began to die down, so did our conversation. The fire had burned low again, the embers glowing softly, and the cabin was filled with a comfortable silence. Caleb's head was resting against the arm of the couch, his eyes half closed, and I couldn't help but watch him. There was something about the way the firelight played across his face, highlighting the sharp lines of his jaw and the softness in his expression, that made my chest ache. "Stop staring," he murmured, a lazy smile tugging at his lips. I felt my cheeks heat up, but I didn't look away. "I'm not staring," I said, my voice betraying me. "You are," he teased, opening one eye to look at me. "But I don't mind." I rolled my eyes, but the smile on my face betrayed me. Caleb reached out, his fingers brushing against mine, and the warmth of his touch sent a familiar shiver up my spine. He tugged gently, pulling me closer until I was lying beside him on the couch. It was a tight fit, but neither of us seemed to care. His arm draped over my waist, holding me close, and I felt myself relax into him. For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel the need to overthink or second-guess. I didn't feel the weight of expectations or the fear of what might come next. All I felt was Caleb, his warmth, his steadiness, and the quiet reassurance that, for now, this was enough. As my eyes grew heavy and sleep began to pull me under, I realized something I hadn't been able to admit to myself before. Being here with Caleb, in this cabin that held so many memories, felt like coming home. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of what that might mean. I woke to the sound of birds chirping and sunlight streaming through the cabin's small windows. For a moment, I forgot where I was, the comfort and warmth of the couch lulling me into a false sense of normalcy. Then I felt the weight of Caleb's arm draped over me, his body pressed close, and reality came rushing back. He was still asleep, his breathing slow and steady, his chest rising and falling against my back. I stayed still, torn between savoring the moment and pulling away before he woke up. The events of the night before replayed in my mind. His touch, his kiss, the unspoken words between us. It felt surreal, like something out of a dream, and yet the weight of it was impossible to ignore. I carefully shifted, trying not to wake him, but his arm tightened around me instinctively. "You're not sneaking away, are you?" His voice was groggy, laced with sleep, but there was a teasing edge to it. "I thought you were asleep," I said, turning to look at him. couldn't let you escape that easily," he replied with a lazy grin, his eyes half open but focused on me. His hair was a mess, and there was a faint crease on his cheek from the pillow, but somehow he still managed to look effortlessly good. It wasn't fair. "You make it sound like I'm trying to run away," I said, though part of me wondered if he wasn't entirely wrong. The thought of facing whatever this was in the light of day was daunting. "Aren't you?" he asked, his tone light but his eyes searching mine for something deeper. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I shifted to sit up, running a hand through my hair. The fire had long since died out and the cabin was chilly, but the sunlight streaming through the windows brought a sense of clarity I hadn't had the night before. "I don't know what I'm doing, Caleb," I admitted finally, my voice quieter than I intended. "I don't even know what this is." He sat up too, the grin fading from his face as he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I don't know either," he said, his voice steady, "but I know I don't want to go back to pretending there's nothing here. Do you?" The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Part of me wanted to say yes, to insist that we could go back to how things were, to the safety of ignoring the tension that had always been there. But the other part of me, the part that had felt so alive in his arms last night, couldn't bear the thought of letting it go. "No," I said finally, the word feeling both terrifying and freeing at the same time. "I don't want to pretend anymore." Caleb's shoulders relaxed slightly, and he turned to look at me, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Good," he said simply, "because I don't think I could go back, even if I tried." The honesty in his words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I felt a strange mix of relief and fear settle over me. This wasn't just some fleeting moment of weakness or confusion. It was real, and it was something we couldn't ignore anymore. We spent the rest of the morning in a strange kind of limbo, neither of us quite sure how to navigate this new dynamic. We fell into an easy rhythm of making breakfast, cleaning up, and taking a walk down to the lake, the conversation light and familiar. But beneath it all, there was an unspoken tension, a current that pulled at us with every glance, every accidental brush of hands. By the time we made it back to the cabin, the sun was high in the sky, and the air was warm despite the lingering chill of the previous night's storm. Caleb suggested we sit out on the porch, and I agreed, grateful for the fresh air and the distraction. The porch swing creaked softly as we sat side by side, the lake shimmering in the distance. Caleb leaned back, his arm draped casually over the back of the swing, his fingers just barely grazing my shoulder. It was such a small thing, but it sent my heart racing all the same. "You're quiet," he said after a while, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. "What's going on in that head of yours?" I hesitated, unsure how to put my thoughts into words. Finally, I said, "I'm just trying to figure out where we go from here." "Does it have to be complicated?" Caleb asked, turning to look at me. "Can't we just see where this takes us?" His words were simple, but they carried a weight that was hard to ignore. I wanted to believe it could be that easy, that we could let things happen without overthinking or worrying about the consequences. But a lifetime of caution and self-doubt made it hard to let go. "I'm not sure I know how to do that," I admitted, my voice quieter than I intended. Caleb reached out, his hand warm as it settled on mine. "You don't have to have all the answers," he said. "You just have to trust me." I looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, this could work. Maybe we could figure it out together, one step at a time. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting golden light over the cabin and the trees. We stayed on the porch until the shadows grew long and the air turned cool, talking about everything and nothing. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't alone. As the day turned to night, the tension between us began to build again, the unspoken pull growing stronger with every passing moment. It was in the way Caleb's hand lingered on mine, the way his eyes seemed to darken when they met mine, the way his voice dropped when he said my name. When we finally went back inside, the cabin felt smaller somehow, the walls closing in around us. Caleb was close behind me as I walked to the fireplace, his presence a constant weight at my back. When I turned to face him, the intensity in his gaze stole the breath from my lungs. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice low and rough, his hand coming up to cup my jaw. "If you don't want this, tell me now." I couldn't. I didn't want to. Instead, I closed the small distance between us, my lips finding his in a kiss that was anything but hesitant. It was desperate, hungry, the kind of kiss that left no room for doubt or hesitation. Caleb's hands gripped my hips, pulling me closer, and I felt the last of my defenses crumble. This wasn't just crossing a line, it was obliterating it, leaving no way to go back. But in that moment, I didn't care. All that mattered was Caleb, the feel of his hands on me, the weight of his body against mine, and the knowledge that, for better or worse, we were in this together. Time seemed to blur as we moved together, the weight of unspoken words and years of tension melting away in the firelight. Caleb's touch was both grounding and electrifying, his hands steady as they explored the planes of my back, the curve of my jaw, every inch of skin he could reach. It wasn't just physical. It was as though he was memorizing me, committing every detail to memory as though afraid this moment might slip away. And maybe I was doing the same. The fire in the hearth had dwindled to embers, the cabin bathed in a soft, golden glow that seemed to amplify every sound. The creak of the floorboards, the gentle rustle of fabric, the quiet hitch in Caleb's breath as my hands slid over his shoulders. Every moment felt magnified, every sensation heightened, as though the cabin itself was alive, bearing witness to what was happening within its walls. When we finally paused, our breathing ragged and our foreheads pressed together, I felt a wave of emotion crash over me. There was no escaping the enormity of what had just happened, the line we'd crossed, the way it had changed everything between us. Caleb's hands rested on my hips, his grip firm but comforting, as though to anchor me to the moment. "You okay?" he asked softly, his voice laced with concern. I nodded, though I wasn't sure the word "okay" even began to cover what I was feeling. "Yeah," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I think so." He smiled then, that same easy, boyish grin I'd seen 1,000 times before, but now it held something deeper, something more vulnerable. "Good," he said, "because I don't think I can let you go now." The words were like a spark, reigniting everything we'd just shared, and I felt my heart tighten in my chest. It wasn't just the passion or the connection we'd uncovered. It was the knowledge that this was real, that it mattered in a way neither of us had been willing to admit before. We moved to the couch, the air between us still charged but softened now by the quiet intimacy of the moment. Caleb pulled a blanket over us, his arm draped casually over my shoulders as I leaned into him. It felt natural, easy, and yet my mind was racing with the implications of what came next. "What now?" I asked finally, breaking the silence. He tilted his head to look at me, his eyes searching mine. "What do you want to happen?" The question caught me off guard, not because I didn't know the answer, but because it was the first time I'd been asked to truly consider it. I wanted this, him, but I also knew it wasn't that simple. There were layers to peel back, complications to navigate, and a future to figure out. "I want to try," I said after a moment, my voice steady despite the knot in my chest. "I don't know how or what it'll look like, but I want to try." Caleb's smile was small but genuine, his hand tightening on my shoulder. That's all I needed to hear. We stayed like that for hours, the weight of the world outside the cabin temporarily forgotten. We talked about everything, our fears, our hopes, the messy history that had led us to this moment. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when the reality of it all threatened to overwhelm me. But Caleb's presence, his unwavering support, made it feel possible. As dawn began to break, painting the sky with soft hues of pink and gold, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. The road ahead wasn't clear, and I knew there would be challenges we hadn't even begun to face. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't alone. The cabin, with all its memories and history, had become something more, a beginning, a place where we could rebuild not just our relationship, but ourselves. And as I looked at Caleb, his face softened by the morning light, I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together.